The desert had always been quiet there. Before the war, Kuwait did not echo with artillery or the movement of armies. It echoed with commerce. With engines pulling into ports, with air conditioning humming behind glass towers, rising improbably from sand. At night, lights reflected off the Persian Gulf like constellations fall into earth. Wealth condensed into a narrow strip of land that seemed to defy geography itself. Kuwait was not a battlefield. It was a vault. A small country with no strategic depth, no natural barriers, no population large enough to defend itself by force alone. What it possessed instead lay beneath the sand oil reserves so vast, they transformed a once modest chiefdom into one of the richest states on earth. Wealth bought stability. Stability bought confidence. And confidence, over time, began to resemble vulnerability. The desert does not forgive complacency. For decades, Kuwait had lived beside a larger neighbor whose history was heavier, whose scars were deeper, whose ambitions had been shaped by humiliation and survival. Iraq had emerged from the Iran-Iraq War exhausted, indebted, and armed to the teeth. 8 years of slaughter had bled its economy dry. Cities were damaged. Infrastructure strained. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The war had ended without victory, without reward-only bills. And those bills mattered. Iraq owed tens of billions of dollars, much of it to the very Gulf states that had supported its fight against Iran. Kuwait was among them. To Baghdad, these were not simple loans. They were contributions to a shared survival. Iraq believed it had fought a war on behalf of the Arab world, shielding it from Iranian expansion. Debt, in that logic, felt less like obligation and more like betrayal. Oil became the language through which this resentment spoke.
Some wars announce themselves with speeches. Others arrive overnight, sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. In August 1990, Kuwait was not just invaded. It was smothered. Cities burned, skies turned black, and an entire nation disappeared beneath fire, smoke, and occupation. We examine how power, ambition, and miscalculation can reduce a country to ash in a matter of hours. I'm Rayo. And here, we don't just recount invasions. We trace the moment a nation stops breathing.
Prices had fallen. Production quotas were contested. Kuwait pumped more than its share. Keeping prices low at the exact moment Iraq needed them high to recover. Each extra barrel on the market tightened Iraq's economic throat. In Baghdad, this was not market behavior. It was economic warfare. Old disputes resurfaced. Borders drawn during colonial times were questioned again. Claims that Kuwait had once been part of Iraq returned from the margins of history to the center of political rhetoric. Accusations followed of slant drilling, of theft from shared oil fields, of disrespect toward a nation that had sacrificed everything and received nothing. Diplomacy flickered, then failed. Meetings were held, statements issued, warnings offered and dismissed. The world watched with the detached confidence of a post-Cold War order that believed large-scale aggression had become unlikely. The Gulf was rich, interconnected, rational, so it seemed. Then, in the early hours of August 2nd, 1990, the desert moved. Iraqi armor crossed the border with speed and certainty. Columns rolled forward under the cover of darkness, their advance precise, rehearsed, unstoppable. Kuwait's defenses, never designed for such an assault, collapsed almost immediately. Resistance was sporadic. Communication failed. Leadership fled or went underground. The invasion was over before the world could process it. In less than 2 days, Kuwait ceased to function as a sovereign state. Government buildings were seized. Ports were controlled. The royal family escaped across the sea. What had been a country became occupied territory almost overnight. For the first time in a generation, conquest had returned undeniable, unapologetic. The shock was not just regional, it was global. This was not a civil war or a proxy conflict buried in distant jungles or mountains. This was armored divisions crossing an international border in full view of satellites and cameras. The post-war assumption that such acts belonged to history collapsed under the weight of tank tracks in the sand. And then the war changed shape. Iraq fortified its new possession, digging in along the border with Saudi Arabia. The desert filled with entrenchments, minefields, artillery. What had been an act of sudden aggression settled into occupation. Kuwait cities lived under foreign rule. Looting followed. Infrastructure stripped, identity erased, deliberately, methodically. For months, tension thickened the air. On television screens across the world, maps glowed. Analysts gestured at arrows and formations. This was the first war of its kind, watched as it developed, narrated in real time, absorbed nightly into living rooms. The distance between battlefield and audience collapsed. War became spectacle without losing its lethality. Then came the day the desert caught fire. When the air campaign began, it did not resemble past wars. Precision-guided munitions streaked through darkness. Radar installations vanished. Command centers dissolved in flashes of light. The sky over Iraq and Kuwait pulsed with explosions that looked surgical, almost unreal. But the fire that would define the war came later. As Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait under relentless pressure, they ignited the oil fields. Hundreds of wells burned at once, pillars of flame punching into the sky. Thick black smoke rose and spread, blotting out the sun. Day turned to twilight, then to night. 4 months, the sky remained dark. Oil rained back onto the sand. The air tasted of sulfur and ash. Flames roared with the sound of a living thing, untamable, consuming what had once been wealth and stability. Satellites captured images that looked apocalyptic, Earth scarred by fire, visible from space. It was environmental destruction on a scale rarely witnessed. And it was intentional. The war reached its climax, not in a single battle, but in that vision. A small country reclaimed at the cost of turning its greatest asset into poison and smoke. Liberation came with devastation woven into it. When the fires were finally extinguished, Kuwait emerged scarred but intact. Rebuilding began almost immediately. Money flowed. Infrastructure rose again. Glass towers returned to the skyline. The vault was restored. The country survived because it could afford to. Iraq did not. The war left it weakened, isolated, sanctioned, its economy stranglelit for years to come. The invasion that had promised relief delivered long-term collapse. The fire that darkened the sky also marked the beginning of a slow descent, whose consequences would echo for decades. The Gulf War ended quickly by historical standards, but its meaning did not. It revealed how fragile order truly was, how wealth could invite catastrophe, how unresolved debts and grievances could ignite entire regions, and how modern war broadcast live could burn itself into global memory before the smoke even cleared. When the desert finally cooled, the scars remained. Some were visible from orbit, others only in history. And all of them began on the day Iraq turned Kuwait to ashes. The fires did not end when the shooting stopped. They lingered in the air, in the lungs, in the memory of anyone who had watched the horizon burn for weeks without interruption. Firefighting teams arrived from across the world, engineers, specialists, men trained to wrestle with disasters no one had ever planned for at that scale. They moved slowly across fields that still hissed with heat, cutting off oxygen, capping wells that roared like jet engines, working inside a landscape that looked less like a country than the aftermath of a planetary collision. Each extinguished flame revealed what remained. Sand soaked in oil, metal warped beyond recognition, machinery reduced to skeletons. What had once been symbols of wealth now lay twisted, blackened, mute. The liberation of Kuwait had not restored the past. It had exposed the cost of its preservation. And yet, reconstruction began almost immediately. Money rebuilt what fire destroyed. Contracts were signed. Cranes rose. Roads were repaved. Towers returned to the skyline with remarkable speed. Glass and steel reflecting sunlight that had been absent for months. Kuwait reasserted itself, not through memory, but through capacity. It survived because it could absorb catastrophe financially. This, too, was a lesson. The war had proven that vulnerability was not only about size or military strength, it was about position. Kuwait had been small, rich, exposed and therefore irresistible when the regional balance fractured. Its recovery did not erase that truth. It underlined it. For Iraq, there was no similar recovery. The retreat from Kuwait marked the beginning of a long constriction. Sanctions tightened. Infrastructure collapsed further. Civilian life deteriorated under economic pressure that did not distinguish between regime and population. The war that had been meant to solve Iraq's crisis entrenched it instead, locking the country into years of hardship and isolation. The invasion had been fast. The consequences were not. What followed was a slow erosion of economy, of legitimacy, of stability. The same oil that had been seen as salvation now flowed under restrictions, monitored, limited, politicized. The region's balance shifted irreversibly. Trust was shattered. Precedents were set. The world had intervened decisively, but selectively. The message was clear. Borders could still be defended, but only when interests aligned strongly enough, quickly enough. The Gulf War became a demonstration of overwhelming force, applied with precision and restraint. A new model of conflict in a post-Cold War world. It was also a warning. War could return suddenly, even in an era that believed itself past such ruptures. Wealth could become liability, and disputes left unresolved economic, historical, territorial could ignite with astonishing speed. For those who watched it unfold live on their screens, the war felt strangely distant and intimate at the same time. Explosions framed by night vision green, briefings delivered like broadcasts, a conflict consumed in real time, edited by networks, explained by experts, absorbed as spectacle. But on the ground, the desert remembered differently. It remembered the weight of tanks, the heat of firestorms, the silence that followed devastation. Kuwait learned that security purchased through prosperity alone was an illusion. Iraq learned that desperation expressed through force invites consequences that lasts far longer than the moment of decision. And the world learned briefly that order is not permanent, only maintained. The Gulf War did not reshape the Middle East overnight. It did something quieter and more enduring. It hardened positions. It planted grievances that would resurface years later under different names and banners. When the smoke finally cleared, the desert looked calm again. But beneath the sand, the imprint of fire remained. And so did the memory of the day when a small, wealthy country was reduced to ash, not because it was weak, but because it stood at the intersection of ambition, debt, oil, and history. The war ended. The consequences did not. The consequences unfolded quietly, without the spectacle that had defined the war itself. In Kuwait, daily life resumed with a discipline learned under trauma. Offices reopened, schools filled, ports hummed again. The country did not linger on mourning in public. It invested in restoration. Beneath the polished surfaces, however, memory persisted. The invasion had lasted only days, but it had rewritten how Kuwait saw itself. Wealth no longer felt like armor. Geography no longer felt neutral. Security became a permanent calculation. Every rebuilt street carried an unspoken understanding. Survival had depended on forces far beyond the nation's control. Across the border, Iraq absorbed the aftermath in a different register. The war's end did not bring relief. It brought containment. The economy constricted year after year. Life narrowed by shortages and restrictions that transformed the landscape from one of ambition to one of the invasion that had promised economic breathing room became the justification for long-term pressure. The desert that had carried tanks now carried sanctions. The region adjusted its posture. Alliances hardened. Military bases multiplied. The Gulf became a place of constant readiness, watched and watching, its calm surface masking a persistent tension. The war had not closed a chapter. It had introduced a new grammar of power rapid deployment, coalition warfare, precision strikes, and the normalization of live broadcast conflict. For the world, the lesson seemed simple, then proved incomplete. Borders mattered. Oil mattered. Speed mattered. But so did restraint, aftermath, and the lives that followed the moment of decision. The Gulf War was remembered as short and decisive. Yet its shadow stretched far beyond its duration. It shaped policy, posture, and perception. It framed future conflicts as problems to be managed quickly. Cleanly and expectation history would repeatedly challenge. The desert returned to stillness. Wind smoothed the scars where it could. Time dulled the blackened edges of memory, but did not erase them. Satellites no longer saw smoke columns. Yet the imprint of fire remained etched into archives, into lungs, into the calculations of leaders who learned how fast a quiet place could become the center of the world. Kuwait endured by rebuilding. Iraq endured by surviving. Between them lay a lesson written in ash, that prosperity without security invites risk, and desperation without patience invites ruin. The war had not been inevitable, but once begun, its logic accelerated beyond diplomacy's reach. When people remember that day, they remember the flames. They remember a sky turned black at noon, a horizon burning as if the earth itself had been breached. They remember watching history unfold in real time, believing that witnessing it meant understanding it. Understanding came later. It came with the recognition that modern wars do not end when the last shot is fired. They settle into structures, into habits, into assumptions that guide what follows. The Gulf War ended quickly because it was designed to. Its consequences endured because they were never meant to, and so the desert stands again, quiet, expansive, indifferent, holding the memory of the day when ambition met vulnerability, when oil became fire, and when a small, wealthy nation learned how fragile stability can be. The world moved on. The scars remained,